to the grocery store.
Everywhere.
Here we go. Welcome to Wabash Center webinars. It's a good day to have a very needed conversation. I am Nancy Lynn Westfield, Director of the Wabash Center. At the producer's desk is Carly Hollinsby, and Paul Myrie, of course, is the sound engineer. Today, our topic is anti-racism work as the work of the people. During the conversation, questions can be sent to Paul Myrie. Please send them to Paul Myrie's email address at myhrep@wabash.edu. That's myhrep@wabash.edu. This conversation on anti-racism is the fifth in a series of 7 conversations with Melanie Harris and Jennifer Harvey. Reverend Dr. Melanie Harris is Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion of Adran College in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, as well as Professor of Religion and Ethics at Texas Christian University. Dean Harris is a well-known facilitator on conversations to heal the wounds of racism. She has been part of the Wabash leadership and the Wabash community for quite some time. And Reverend Dr. Jennifer Harvey is Professor of Religion at Drake University, where she also serves as the faculty director for the Cru Scholars Program. Dr. Harvey's books on racism include Raising White Children, Bringing Up Children in Racially Unjust America, and Dear White Christians, for those still longing for racial reconciliation. Dr. Harvey is also a longtime leader and participant with the Wabash Center. And we give a special shout out this time to Dr. Harvey's J-term students who are joining us as part of the audience today. So welcome to her students, as well as all the students who have found this webinar. Excuse me. Today, we're starting this conversation recognizing the events that happened in the Capitol and that are still happening in the Capitol. So I want to start our conversation just by opening up the floor and asking each of you to take a turn so you can say, in terms of teaching, in terms of our scholarly life, just whatever there needs to be said to start in this moment. It feels like such a liminal time in a liminal space. So I don't know what that double whammy means, but let's start with Jennifer and just help us orient ourselves. And then we'll go to Melanie and proceed past there. So Jennifer, help us orient ourselves.
Thank you so much, Dr. Westfield, for creating this space today. You know, when you asked that question, I really just thought and still feel that the most basic grounding and connection is all I can sort of imagine orienting toward right now. And so that is to say, for example, as a teacher, teaching liberation, womanist, feminist theologies right now in J-term, a very intensive course with students when the news broke of the Capitol, really understanding that for myself and for our students, whoever they may be, an invitation to pause, breathe, check in around basic sense of safety, both physical safety, but also emotional and intellectual safety, which is just part of that liminality, I think, is nobody in all the diverse ways that we are unsafe, nobody feeling safe. And so even before thinking about, okay, how do I teach this or how do I navigate this pedagogically, is like humanizing with our students our own experience of this and the experiences they are surely having with this, whatever those may be. And in this moment, that's about all I found myself just pivoting to that, like connection, and with added work to figure out, again, what that means when we're in virtual space almost all the time.
Yeah. Thank you. Melanie.
Well, an insurrection has happened of white supremacists and white supremacy in the nation's capital. And that is a wake-up call. In my circles, it's been not just a wake-up call for those who were still blind and staying asleep, especially after the holidays, to racial injustice in our country, but it's also been a deep call to activism for those of us who are deeply engaged. Most of us were ready to hear again that the revolution is here and that this is the revolutionary time. This is the time to take risk in your teaching. This is the time to include all the voices that you feel like the tenure faculty would never approve of. This is the time to continue the conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is the time to create spaces for marginalized faculty and students and staff. So if there was ever a moment in which you felt, oh, 2021 will be a better year, I can take my time rolling into this new semester, that is inaccurate. We are here. This is the time for you to act. And if you need help, there's lots of help around. So I think it's an invitation to recognize that the insurrection on the United States Capitol was surprising to many of us, but not shocking, because we've been engaged in the work, and many of us, kind of have ancestry in our own blood that reminds us that this is possible, that it can happen. And to kind of create spaces in our own thinking and imagining and dreaming about what and how to connect to that kind of ancestral wisdom on finding out what to do and how to handle this.
So
I will
Melanie,
say, on just one more note around self-care, I do think that the dreaming is quite literal. I think we need to be sleeping better as much as possible and taking better care of our health. And I particularly, and it's an odd paradoxical experience, but we need to be active, and then we also need to be taking better care of our rest in order to really hear and be able to centered and grounded enough to be able to make wise decisions in the midst of chaos.
Yeah.
I agree with that. So, but Melanie, keep going, and we'll go to Jennifer. The democracy, the idea, the experimental idea of democracy, which is for me the ultimate equalizer: one person, one vote, regardless of race, regardless of religion, regardless. If you are a citizen of the country, you get one vote equal to the other person's one vote, is what is at stake here. So for those who are saying, well, this is not about race, the insurrection is not about race, and what I teach, I don't know how to get racism into that conversation, that seems so flimsy now. But we know many colleagues, even yet in this moment, will say both of those things. Help us understand, both of you, and we'll start with Melanie, why issues of racism are at hand in every classroom in this moment when democracy, the ultimate equity strategy, is at stake.
Very sadly, the reality is that racism is happening in your classroom. It's likely happening in all of our classrooms, and especially if we are professors who have not been paying attention to racism on the outside of the classroom door, have actually found the kind of refuge space within our classroom, within our studies, to protect us from the outside conversation. If we are in that position, then we have been outed, not only as complicit with racism, but also complicit in any force that would silence people from coming to voice. I think this particular conversation is really important because as the people, anti-racism is key. I think to choose not to acknowledge the reality that students are living in is an invitation to think about religion as an illusion, and the work that we do as performative completely. The process of getting tenure, the pretending with colleagues, and eventually I think that wears on people, whereby you lose your authentic voice as a thinker, and you'll certainly lose your authentic way of being. So we've said this before in our podcast, but this is the time to be alive. now to bring the life of racial justice, but also the realities of the health disparities, the numbers of different racial injustices, and the real deep misinformation and malformation which is showing up potentially at capitals all over the country.
Mm-hmm.
So that's important to pay attention to and to lean into as best you
Mm-hmm.
can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Jen.
Yeah, I mean, I really want to sort of lift up everything Dr. Harris just said. And I think, you know, the emphasis I might offer is sort of, we've got to radically understand that this is not a moment about my content is X. And so therefore there's another reality. If there's another reality happening, that's what the sociologists can teach, or that's what the political scientists can look at. One of the things that has been incredibly powerful in my own class this J term is it happened to be that we were reading Dolores Williams and James Cone the day after, and then the days after the insurrection last Wednesday. And one of the things that was so clear in the work of Black liberationist thought and womanist thought is just this complete unwillingness to call white supremacy anything other than what it is, right? And so one of the things that I heard last week, I can't remember who said this, but I saw a tweet that said the folks at the Capitol were radicalized in the white church, right? Yes, we've been tarrying with that thread in my class. Okay, but our academic institutions, so that's the church, but our academic institutions were also built on white supremacy, right? There's nothing about this enterprise we are involved in other than when subversive insurgent forms of it manifest, like in the historically Black colleges and universities or in the Black church tradition, but there's no other place where in academic contents, we are not sitting on a bedrock of white supremacy. And so to me, that means that if or when, I don't care the subject matter, the context is white supremacy. And so when we don't address that, then we might say we could be, people in institutions, academic institutions end up radicalized into white supremacy, right? Because if it's not, there's no neutrality, there's no uncontextualized space here. We're either full-blown naming and challenging this, or we are cultivating it, enabling it, and allowing it to further. And it's long been true that we needed to make a decision, or we already made a decision if we didn't make a decision. But man, Dr. Westfield, when you say democracy, the ultimate equity strategy, and now we're seeing that's literally under assault, like with weapons.
And it's not a metaphor, right?
It's not, and it's no longer a metaphor. It's not a metaphor.
No.
What are we doing with our students? What are we saying to our institutions they better be doing? Because also, this is on our campuses, right? Mm-hmm. How do we teach those students? What kind of spaces and speech do we allow and disallow, and how? Mm-hmm. And these questions are not in the distant future. They are yesterday.
And so we ask, please, administrators, please don't write any more letters and open letters to the public, right?
That's right.
In this moment, don't write any more open letters to the public. Turn to your students and faculty and say that you are against white supremacy. It's that kind of moment, it feels like.
Yeah.
Right? We are past writing open letters to people, I think, right, in these moments. So we try to spend some time, at least a little bit of time in each of these conversations doing some basic things, and then we'll move on past some of the basics because we're talking about the work of the people in this conversation. So basic things about the work of the people. There are people who still conflate race and racism, right, in conversations. They'll think a conversation on racism will be introduced, and instead of talking about racism, they will talk about race. Both of you help us understand why it is harmful as well as hurtful for people of color when white people conflate race and racism. Melanie, go first.
Well, to conflate race and racism invisibilizes racism, and it also invisibilizes whiteness and white privilege. So it actually presents an impediment to any kind of moving forward in terms of basic collegiality, being able to put together policy documents, being able to be in conversation about basic categories in religious studies. I think that invisibility and that visibilization of race and of talking about racism is quite normative. It usually kind of feels like just the tradition, the way that we do things in a department. But I like the invitation that is here, which is to literally go through and develop together as a faculty a glossary of the different terms that are going around in conversation now in public discourse on the difference between race, racism, ethnicity. What is ethnic studies? What is womanist theology? What is liberation theology? Who is Martin Luther King Jr. and what did he actually preach and teach? And what is this book, Chaos and Community? And is it possible that there are connections here? So some of those things I say almost in trite because there is a sense in which it seems, of course, obvious that we're all talking in the same language. We all have PhDs, we all have a knowledge of the same discourses, but that's actually untrue.
And harmful, right? And difficult.
That's right. Yeah. So I like this invitation to actually kind of think about the actual terms. I will also say that the kind of example that you've presented, Dr. Westfield, is an important one because people of color, I think, have a particular energy that they bring to the distinctions between race and racism, and that energy can feel threatening to white colleagues who are not engaged on a normal basis in conversations around race. So it's important to recognize that literally just bringing this up in a faculty meeting could make people feel very uncomfortable and take people out of white comfort, which is very normative. And I think that white comfort, right, there's another vocabulary word if people are looking for developing a list. Naming that as a normative part of one's department or unit is another way of actually being able to dismantle the space of white privilege enough to be able to bring the reality of the conversation forward. So that's a little bit of a kind of practical way of actually addressing.
That's right. So that's precisely where I was trying to go and saying, when people want to start this conversation, right? The creation of a glossary is not shaming or embarrassing for a community that says we want to learn and mobilize together, right? That we need a glossary. We need to understand how, in this context, when we use these terms, what we're talking about. Jen, go ahead.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a huge echo to that. Like, it's necessary. And if your department hasn't read Ijoma Oluo's book, So You Want to Talk About Race, you can start there. If we read it, argue about it, fine, engage it. It will help you with the glossary. I want to say, so I love, Dr. Harris, how you just lifted up the way that conflating race and racism invisibilizes whiteness and white privilege. And so I want to sort of add the adjacent thing that it does is, and this is also about how important it is that we recognize that, for me, my point of departure in all this has to be a willingness to directly confront whiteness and white supremacy. That there's no neutrality or genericness here. And so the other thing that conflating race and racism does, as it invisibilizes and makes that impossible, is it also invisibilizes Black people, right? Black scholarship, Latino people, Latino scholarship. In this way, conflating race and racism also acts like race, which is a kind of, yes, it's a social construct. Yes, of course. It's also a meaningful, real identity formation that communities have developed, grown, and cultivated over time. And it's not reducible in Black communities to white supremacy, which also means it's not parallel. Black identity is not parallel to white identity. This is not like any invocation of race is racist because these categories and identities don't matter. No, they matter deeply. And if you can't separate them, you cannot value, affirm, and and sort of, you can't value and affirm and meaningfully include, I don't mean that in the watered down include people tokenizing, like meaningfully center racial identities other than those that are white. And that point is really important because white people, white scholars, white teachers think, and we still sort of in our diversity and inclusion work do this, make white identity a parallel in a multicultural universe to Black identity, Puerto Rican identity, and it's not. It is the identity that needs to be confronted, challenged, and reformed, disrupted. And we cannot do that even while, if we conflate race and racism and we erase Black identity and other, when we conflate race and racism, because all invocations of race are not the same and they're not even parallel.
Colleague texted me the day after the Capitol was under siege because he had been walking across campus and 3, 4, he didn't say the number, but multiple white colleagues stopped him to say, "What can we do?" So we're helping our listeners again. That is the doing of something to ask Black people what to do, what to do in this moment of rawness and fear. That gesture is rarely seen as a gesture that is helpful to the situation. But Jennifer, and then I'm going to go to Melanie. Why isn't that helpful? If I'm a white person, I finally have enough courage to ask my colleague, what should we do? Why did he just look at me, roll his eyes, and walk away?
It's not helpful in my understanding because it simultaneously acknowledges you have not valued the humanity of the person that you are now asking to work for you enough to ask the question before, and maybe even equip yourself with the myriad of resources out there to respond to that question. So you didn't do the work before, and you're going to ask it in this moment. But in the very asking, you reveal you've never seen the humanity of this person before, because that's what got in the way of you actually equipping yourself long before this moment. So I say that not to shame those who are asking this question now, because even though I wish you had asked it a long time ago, I'm glad you're asking it now, but don't ask other people on your campus, especially people of color, who right now are experiencing things that I won't begin to put descriptions to, right? If you genuinely need to know what to do, and that is a genuine question now, as surprising as it might be to me that we're only now asking it, there are a million resources that you can turn to without asking the folks who feel most at risk, most under siege, and who have been ignored for this long while being given lip service that we value them perhaps, a million other places to begin. And so this is not the time for interracial kumbaya. It's just not. We need to go be doing some very serious hard work with the many resources that are out there right at our fingertips that people have been paid to produce. So don't ask another bit of work from your colleagues, and certainly not from your students.
Melanie, why do we want to suck our teeth and roll our eyes and walk away? And oftentimes do not do that. Oftentimes actually answer the person. But why is it so visceral when now, in this moment, the question is asked by the white person to the Black colleague, what can we do?
I think there's a visceral reaction in part because there's a recognition that in the moment that one has been ignored until that point, that oftentimes when I've experienced this as a person of color, there is a moment in which I really try to look into the being and ask myself, are they serious? And a part of that question is, are they serious honestly? Because they do not know. And so the part of the process for me is it possible that they are this unaware of race and racial inequality in this country and have lived to this moment in coming to me in such a vast ignorance that they actually feel empowered and privileged to come to me and address me now in my humanity, which they have not honored before. And there is also the question of, are they truly authentic? And oftentimes when I see just a glimmer of authenticity, there is hope. There is hope for transformation. There is hope for awareness, racial awareness, and there is hope that that person can deepen to a point of recognizing not just me, but all people of color as fully human. And that glimmer, and it is a glimmer, it's like seeing just a glimpse of the Holy Spirit or a glimpse of God. It happens very quickly. If you blink, it'll go. Just a glimmer. There is a door that can be opened for healing that person from the white supremacy that they embody, that may be so embedded in them that they themselves don't even realize that they're trapped. And so for me, and it's only because I've had a lot of good anti-racist white people and allies in my life that I no longer give up on that moment, that I actually stay long enough to recognize if indeed there's authenticity there. Now, if there isn't, then yes, I certainly find other ways to direct them. I often visualize myself as a crossing guard at that point, kind of. My son is a little toddler, so I use Daniel Tiger imagery a lot. Daniel Tiger is a cartoon, and it's just a crossing guard, like red, green, yellow, orange, lots of different colors, but not this path. You need to go a different direction. I'm remembering so many of the powerful sermons I've heard during Advent season and the story in the biblical narrative of the wise men going a different direction, after hearing that Herod had decided to kill all of the boys that were born who were under the age of 2, in part because Herod was so furious that there was a possibility of a new leadership that might have actually been freeing and liberating for the people coming on the scene. So I think in that way, we can serve as crossing guards, particularly as people of color, to simply say, I think you should go a different way. And that different way is often means that we take it seriously, our own self-care, and literally ask ourselves, take the pause moment in the same way that you were talking about, Dr. Harvey, which I appreciate. Take a pause, ask yourself, how much time and energy do I have right now to engage this conversation? It could lead to coffee. It could lead to an article. It could lead to a book. And it could lead to the transformation of this white person in America. And I also could be writing the book I'm supposed to be writing for tenure right now with this time and energy, or preparing a meal for a family member, or taking myself out for a little bit of a break, or getting fresh air in a world that is stifled with the air and atmosphere of white supremacy. So I think there's lots of choices and options there for people of color when confronted with that moment.
Ooh, wow. It's such a challenge, right? It is such a challenge. So Melanie, I'm going to stick with you because of something you said earlier, and then Jen, I'll come back to you. You mentioned that often when these conversations come up, whether initiate about racism, the need for anti-racism, about white supremacy, that one of the school cultural objections or the cultural dynamics in a school will allow for defensiveness, which will shut down the conversation. What does it mean to work past white people's defensiveness? So an example is a white person will ask the question of a person of color. The person of color will seize that moment, like you said, and say, well, I will walk with you in this moment, only to find that the white person then gets defensive. What is defensiveness, and why is it such an obstacle to this conversation?
Defensiveness is fear. It's a garment for fear. It is a fear of the unknown, a fear of being found out, and certainly a fear of being found out as not a smart person, also not worthy, an imposter, intellectual and imposter, also not worthy of the moment, and certainly a fear of being caught in their own racism. And so recognizing what defensiveness actually is allows, I think, the person of color to take that authority, for lack of a better word, but to assess the energy that's being exchanged. And here I have to say some of my own work in anti-racism, particularly as a person of color with contemplative practice, shows up very meaningfully. There is a point in which one recognizes how to center one's energy so as to focus it. And when you see a defensiveness or you see a defensiveness act, perhaps the person looks down, becomes angry, enraged, at the self, but also at the person in front of you. There is a sense in which the energy that they are in is so unstable that you can't actually talk to that person at that point, right? Even if you were to recite every single principle and ethic of womanist ethics and Katie Cannon's essay and Martin Luther King's speeches, they would not hear it. And presenting them with a PDF on white fragility is also probably not appropriate for them in that particular moment. So you just have to kind of assess the energy of the defensiveness. If it's high defensiveness, then that's not the right moment. If it's defensiveness in a little kind of way, but there's a way that there's a signal of some trust, then you can assess whether or not you have and the time and whether you have invested enough in that particular person, the relationship, so as to go and to grow. Now, this is particularly important in terms of students, right? Because many of our students, I know for my white students, they come unaware, and some of them come mapped with literally so many frames of white supremacy that it's just a part of their orientation and how they meet me as a professor, but also how they meet their fellow students, how they meet the community. As a teacher, especially as a scholar of color, I actually give a lot more grace to my students than I do for my faculty colleagues who have PhDs and should know who the works of Katie Cannon, James Cone, many other critical race theorists. They're paid to think and read, and that they do not read and that they do not think. That, to me, that's wrong. That's wrong. But the students don't know that yet. The students don't know. So I think some element of grace can be offered to the students, particularly to white students who are coming into the space, who are there to learn and they are there to transform, and at least in a space where some kind of trust has been built between students and professors. They are willing to take the risk, and they are actually trusting us as professors to create a space where they can transform and not be abused and not be shamed and not be embarrassed. And I think especially for graduate students, that their dissertations will not be ridiculed or stolen. So there is some trust, I think, that has to be there, but certainly grace for students who are still learning.
So Jennifer, many institutions have a racist culture that creates obstacles to anti-racist work by the fear of open conflict. So defensiveness is one characteristic of a culture that needs to be addressed to do anti-racism work, both individually and collectively. Another characteristic of racist culture is fear of open conflict. Anti-racist conversation will invariably spark conflict. What do you say to people who say, we're not risking open conflict?
My honest, direct response to that would be, well, we're just going to live with open conflict. Like we're living with open conflict.
It's conflictual now for somebody.
Just because we don't talk about it, just because I'm not the one that's feeling the conflict's in the room. So it's not we're going to live with open conflict or not option. It's a how we're going to move into and through this conflict. And I think for me, there's some really granular, critically important messages that I think white scholars, administrators need to hear. So on the one hand, like defensiveness and rage and fear of conflict. Like, white socialization has damaged white people. Okay,
Right.
so sometimes folks are defensive because of shame. That's a real, Tandeka wrote about this years ago. And it was a hard book for some folks to read, including many scholars of color, I think, in spaces because it felt like she was trying to make people feel bad for white people, which was not her purpose. But she was trying to give us a map of what white socialization does to damage white people. And that damage, unredressed and healed, traumatizes and perpetrates against people of color, right? Shame's in there, rage is in there. Resma Menakem, whose book, My Grandmother's Hands, we need to be reading that book, talks about traumas in the body and that all of us are traumatized from the racialized trauma is what we're all living with. For white people, it's the racialized trauma that gets handed down generationally of being a perpetrator of violence. Mm. So there's some deep stuff here that's got to be attended to. However, when we are in collective spaces where we're attending to policies and the culture of our institutions and making faculty manual changes around transforming the climate, we cannot and must not slow down and stop that work until all the white people in the room have done their healing work. We just can't. Yeah. So when I think about collective spaces where we're trying to initiate stuff that might generate conflict or make white people defensive, when I'm in collective space, my posture as a white person is, we are moving this forward. We're going to make, strategic alliances. We're going to find the folks in the room and work together to sort of advance, be strategic about moving the needle institutionally and in the ethos of the climate. But I always say over and over again, and if this is confusing or hard for you, let's have a conversation. I will talk to anybody. Let's have coffee. I'll talk with any shame-filled white person who wants to have a conversation because I've lived it too. The rage part is different. That feels a little like but we don't attend to and slow down for that in collective space as we change the climate of an institution, whatever that climate, whatever particular part of the climate. We need to be as strategic as organizers, move things forward, equip people, right? We put fodder in there, get folks learning, getting the glossary on the table, getting the transformation of understanding in the room, but we don't stop until everybody's totally on board. That's also a version of democracy and governance. You move along. And then those of us who are white and I certainly know and have friends, colleagues of color, one of them is on this call who does this a lot. I'm always in awe of it, who also will sometimes be willing to sit down with some defensive white people. But we don't make that the work of changing the ethos. We say, you know what? And if I noticed in that meeting, you were seeming really upset. Can we just have a conversation? I'd love to understand what you were so upset about. But we don't make that where we stop the work. Like the work must go forward, and we've got to figure out who on our campuses is ready, willing, and able to do it, even if we don't like them. And we need to get our heads together and start to move some of the institutional policies and climates in the spaces that we work and teach. Because if we don't, we are going to continue enabling the catastrophic takeover of this democracy. Like that's like this is the crisis we are in. Will our institutions stand up? And we are part of those institutions.
So you're saying ignore or find ways around the obstacle of perfectionism, right? So yes. What you just described is you'll go and help, and faculty who says, yes, we want to do this anti-racism work. You show up as a consultant, you show up as a colleague. And because they can't get, quote, everybody on board, they are somehow stymied and we just can't move forward.
Right. I hear that all the time. How do we convince everyone? I'm like,
that's
forward. Not the goal. You don't try and convince everyone.
That's right. Perfectionism is not the goal.
Sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's we're all talking about the same thing. We're all talking about the same thing.
I think you start where you are. And whether you're a dean or a president or a faculty person, even if you're a student, you start where you are and you name where you are and don't lie about that. I mean, you be honest about where you actually are. And right now we're in a failing attempt at democracy. And so it's a good invitation to return back to the definition of democracy and why it's important to be able to talk across the aisle in a variety of different ways, and how religion and religious discourse allows us to talk across the aisle, and how it doesn't, how it actually presents impediments for us actually continuing the conversation around difference, but particularly around racial difference. When we talk about, this wonderful idea of a glossary and having the first conversation on a faculty department, or having the first conversation around race and reconciliation, even, or reparations. I think what we're also recognizing is that many of our units have never actually talked before.
That's right. That's right. About anything substantive.
About anything. Like we
Mhm.
don't even know about each other's paths, each other's lives, the intellectual influences that are with each other. And particularly for scholars of color in the liberation theology movement and womanist theology, that heritage and tradition, that's your bread and butter. I mean, that's how you enter into the work and enter into your own voice, recognizing that there is a legacy, a heritage, a deep, rich heritage of talk from a variety of different angles of religiosity and spirituality. Some of it's theistic, some of it's non-theistic, some of it's atheistic, but there are a lot of different conversations that have happened before you appeared onto the scene. And I think oftentimes in deeply, deeply white supremacist and very hierarchical institution environments, it is assumed that the white male scholar is the first person who has ever thought of this brilliant idea that's being poured out of their mouth. And that kind of arrogance then, of course, is touted, unfortunately, by not just white scholars, but also the arrogance can come out of the scholars of color.
The paternalism needs to be checked, right? Even if we don't, even if scholars say they don't understand racism, the same ones that say they don't understand racism or act like they don't certainly have some critique of paternalism. We have to understand that there is no one right way. So if you haven't had a conversation with each other, even if you're an all-white department, you have not taken time to see the diversity of stories even among the whiteness that is gathered there. So there's this assumption, another cultural obstacle, that there is one right way to getting anything done. And that's simply not the case. It's not realistic. It's not the truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think this, it's what we're saying. At the beginning of the new semester, many of us are just getting ready to get started with students, getting ready to think through program ideas for getting our colleagues together, even virtually. This is an opportunity to step back and to try to recognize that many of us don't have a communications plan in place, generally speaking, whether it was, COVID related or not. We don't have a communications plan. And we just have such a poor way of communicating with each other. And so this is an opportunity, I think. When the US Capitol is attacked, you want to ask yourself some basic questions. Do I have access to information? Am I safe where I am? Are those people who I care about, love, appreciate, are they safe? You're not necessarily thinking about, is my book going to be published in the next year? Or did my pedagogy work right 5 years ago? You're not thinking about that. You're thinking about the basics. And I think one of the basics is a communications plan.
So one of the I'm talking about obstacles to the shifting these cultures of schools, right? So one of the major obstacle, and then Paul will come to you for questions. If you have a question for our panel, email Paul Myrie at myhrep@wabash.edu. Administrators and people will say, I am down with this program. I am ready to go. I'm going to do a glossary. I'm going to do a communication plan. I'm going to do the things that you are suggesting to shift this culture. But I'm just too busy. I just have too much on my plate. You don't understand you don't understand that the dean is pressuring me, the provost, the chancellor, the vice president, is pressuring me. I just can't get around to it. I'm too busy.
I've heard this before in my own home institution for many years, decades almost, and also in a number of institutions that I consult with. When one says that they have no time for diversity work, diversity training in the old sense of the term, which can be very harmful, when one says that one has no time to actually examine whiteness and white culture and how it may be permeating the atmosphere where they work, you are essentially putting on the chopping block, or the cross, so to speak, the lives, scholarships, opportunities, and careers of not just the people of color, but of everyone in the unit. We are living in an age, particularly in the study of religion, where we can basically, kind of count on maybe two hands the jobs that will be open in a particular region. People are not flocking to mainstream religion in the United States of America in the way that they used to. So we are seeing departments of religion cut. We're seeing jobs disappear. We're seeing innovative new ideas about undergraduate programs in religion working interdisciplinarily with other units on campus and beyond. We're seeing theological schools come up with new ideas on how to reinvent themselves. But we're living in a precarious time that begs us to recognize this is actually not the time to say you don't have time. If you don't have time, you're thinking of, you could be looking at a department that may not be seen as meaningful and useful for the movement of higher education, and particularly in an institutional context. To be unrelevant, to not make these connections, and to call yourselves religious. I think that it's not just administrators who will be asking that question, but certainly communities and certainly potential students.
Jennifer?
Yeah, that was brilliantly put. If you don't have time now, then you're never going to have time. And the way you just sort of described the arc and the connections between the shrinkage and the extinction and dying of many of our fields is deeply connected to the unwillingness and incapacity to challenge, normative white supremacy sooner and in sustained ways, and completely transform what we even understand ourselves to be doing. And I guess, I tend to and sometimes it's a strength and sometimes it's a flaw, to always sort of want to pivot to the sort of okay, so what do I do in my institution right now then? When the administrator's saying that, how do I, and there's importance about that, because action really, really matters. And there's risks when I do that, because it can risk sort of sound, being oh, there's simplistic solutions here, and there's simply not. But I do think there's a deep-seated white proclivity to not notice that we choose our priorities, we choose how we spend our time, and to sort of think that it's by magic that people of color are really good at diversity in forms of sort of scholarship and thinking and engaging diverse student populations, or really good at anti-racist interventions when hostile climates present themselves. And that is learned expertise that is, besides being really difficult and painful, also took time and and it wasn't a choice, right? Because survival. But for white folks, then it's not going to happen by magic. We have to say, this is the priority, period. And if I'm in a unit where I work with other heads of units, I need to be part of the voice that says, we are going to make this the priority. If this means we drop X, Y, and Z for the next 3 years, so be it.
So be it.
What else are we doing? What else are we doing? So it's a choice. It's a choice. And there's so much in this webinar series that we've been talking about where there's a tendency in the white formation to be so passive and think this all just kind of happens. It doesn't happen. Silence is a choice. Not being ready is a choice. And, you know, before we formally started recording, Dr. Westfield, you were talking about this sort of tendency to, when folks will say like, well, I'm afraid we're not going to try anything because we don't want to do it wrong. There's this, diluted white thinking that not doing anything isn't causing harm, right? Try something. As you were saying, try anything. Yes, be cautious not to cause worse harm than doing nothing, but there's very little in this moment that could cause worse harm than doing nothing. So try something. And again, we have to disrupt this sort of passive response to this that thinks this is just going to magically all be okay. The arc of history doesn't, it doesn't move by itself. We move it or we choose to let it not be moved.
Dr. Myrie,
Thank you.
the three of us enjoy each other's company, so we'll continue to talk.
Yeah, I always enjoy these conversations. Think the hour is too short. While you've been talking, the House did vote to impeach the president.
Okay.
Wow. Thanks for
And-
letting us know.
And then one person, this is a quick question, asked about a book by a scholar of color that Jennifer spoke about that addressed shame as whites express it in facing their racism. She didn't hear the title. She wanted to hear the title.
Tandeka's book.
The title is Learning to Be White. It's by Thandeka, Thandeka. It's quite old, early 90s. Very provocative at the time. Personally, I actually, there's still portions of it I teach, even though some of it's somewhat dated, because I don't agree with everything that's in there, all of the analysis, but there's some really just like brilliant openings that she just hones in on that changed for me all the ways I understood, even my own experience in my 20s, that have been just life transformative and really helpful to conversations in multiracial classrooms. Sorry.
That's right. So, but her premise is so provocative that whiteness is learned.
Yep.
The normativity of whiteness assumes that, somehow whiteness comes from the inside rather than from the inside out rather than the outside in. And we know it comes from the outside in. So Tandeka was a pioneer in this conversation in calling white people and whiteness to accountability and to looking in the mirror, turning the spotlight on themselves to see, well, how was this created and what has it wrought from me, right? That she really immerses one of the chapters, one of my favorite chapter, on the punishment that happens to make you into a white person.
Yep.
And the threat of alienation that forces you to become a white person. So like you said, an older book. I'm not sure if it's still in print. Is it still in print, do you think?
I suspect it's probably not, but I bet you could find it.
Yeah. You can find it.
Another question from one of the listeners today. It's a rather long question. She said it's my many layered question. So I'll give you the layers and you determine how you want to respond. As a white person, I am learning that I have work that is mine to do, and it may not be the shared work that is the community's to do. How do we differentiate the ways we each participate in the communal work? And what would you recommend for differentiating between the personal work that may differ for individuals and the communal work? Is there some communal work that can only begin once some personal work has been done, particularly on the part of white or otherwise privileged community members? How do we address this reality without continuing to center whiteness and white people in conversations about anti-racism? Or is there another way to approach this entirely that I'm missing because of my own limited perspective?
Can I speak to that a little bit?
Please.
So I think even just starting to ask the question is actually really important discernment work. I mean, I hear a lot of discernment going on in the question because there's no exact correct way to do it. And the way I often think about this when I'm stuck is, okay, white supremacy has created a whole bunch of no-win scenarios. And so we aren't going to do a perfect path through any of this, right? We need to not center whiteness, and yet we need to talk about it more. How do you do those two things at the same time? It's really difficult. And so part of the methodology for me is putting that right on the table, whether I'm thinking about how to approach something, or even sometimes when I'm talking and presenting stuff, it's like, here's the paradox, and we're just going to have to like wrestle, keep that in the center, right? It's kind of how theologians kind of, we're going to talk about God, but really careful because we can't really talk about God. So I think that one tool I will sometimes use with myself, I think there's a lot of personal reflective work that personal and individual is not necessarily the same thing. So there's a lot of reflective growth, personal work that white people need to do, but also they're sometimes served by doing in pairs or in groups, right? But when it comes to communal space, I start to try and really check in and think, how much time and energy in this space, in some ways in collective space, so I don't know, again, if we're talking about a faculty, whatever the configuration we're talking about, it can actually, if guidelines are in place for the discussion to have some guardrails, I have experienced it to potentially be really helpful. I've heard from colleagues of color that it's helpful to actually have whiteness be centered in the conversation, because they have a lot of things to say about whiteness. And white people need to hear what people of color who we work with or teach or, have to say about whiteness. But when it comes to capacity building, which is sometimes what we mean when we talk about the personal work, if we're spending too much time, if I'm like, okay, in that collective space, when I say this thing for the fourth time, are people of color really getting anything out of this? If not, this might be one of those things that is better dealt with in a space that by invitation only. So I'm very wary about white only spaces unless they're very carefully accountable and designed. But you can create an invitation space where it's like personal reflection work on whiteness and growth, right? And then people can self-select out of it. But to be cautious about work that is helping white people get their capacity growth, that's really like, your colleagues like, why do I have to sit through this? I don't need this capacity building. I've been doing this since I was 5 years old. Too much of that starts to go, oh, this is better in a different kind of forum, but it's still important work that feeds the ability for us to do collective work that is very capacity building, and in which sometimes whiteness actually is the conversation, because it shouldn't be the only conversation. But I know that in my multiracial classrooms, I experience with my students excitement and readiness to talk about whiteness for once. But that's different than saying they have things to learn about how to be a better white person. When we start doing that work needs to happen elsewhere. But there's no exact formula.
I think that's very wise. I would only add that the relationship building that one does with people of color only serves the white person better, I think. And the relationship building needs to be certainly one of respect and trust, and not overworking the person of color that one's in relationship with. But oftentimes when one reaches a sense that one has done some inner work and interrogating one's own whiteness, then being in conversation with people who you trust, where you can kind of test your awareness out without being judged or shamed, can be very, very helpful in helping you to kind of move to the next chapter, so to speak, or the next level, so to speak. Because oftentimes, if you are honestly working on yourself, people of color will be able to tell in the way that you relate to them, in the way that you conversate with them, in the way that you are, and the kind of choices and decisions and risks that you're willing to take on a department or in a setting, in an institutional setting. Not having those, kind of, for lack of a better explanation, kind of meditating on your own meditation mat by yourself, getting to nirvana and a state of nirvana and enlightenment, and then coming down off of your holy mountain and, having to make a PBJ sandwich because you have to teach class. That's not going to help anybody. That's not going to help anybody. So it needs to be, certainly there's personal work and that needs to be done, but it needs to be eventually engaged.
Yes.
The only thing I would add is to ask yourself, when you want to have extended, important conversations, how do you have those? With whom do you have them? And duplicate that. So if your important conversations happen around a meal table, then create meals for that important conversation. So you know what I mean? So you have to communicate to people, whether it's white people talking to white people, or white people talking to people of color, or people of color trying to confront white people, whatever the dynamic is, to say this is an important conversation. So let us use the context and the models that we know are effective to create important conversations. Right, so we're not talking about recreating structures, But I'm back to Melanie's earlier point. So many faculty, so many people don't ever have important conversations with people, colleagues, administrators, spouses, right? How do you have important conversations in your life?
I love that.
Thank you.
To our viewers and listeners, the Wabash Center website will have this video as well as audio of this conversation, as well as all the conversations in this anti-racist series. Many thanks to my team, Carly and Paul, who make our digital resources possible. And we are out. What a needed and timely conversation, colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
Dr.
Lynn.
Westfield.
Thank you so much.
Wow.